Welcome to the Blockbusters and Birdwalks podcast. I am the curator, Garrett Chaffin-Quiray. Today we have a conversation with a friend, Ed Rosa.
That's me. Hi. My filmmaking partner and I have a YouTube channel, Toothless Richard Productions, where you can see a number of our short films.
In our back and forth, you pitched me the idea of deliberate controversy. So what does that mean to you?
Great art should provoke. It isn't up to people to tell the artist what they want. So looking at films where the filmmaker seems to have gone out of their way to be deliberately provocative for one reason or another. And the films we'll be watching are Dragged Across Concrete, Last Tango in Paris, Ilsa, She-Wolf of the SS, Basic Instinct, Monty Python's Life of Brian, The Last Temptation of Christ, Bamboozled, and 2000 Mules. "2000 Mules" is about how our Lord and Savior Donald J. Trump actually legitimately won the 2020 election as a result of massive voter fraud conducted by socialist liberals subverting our democracy.
I know going in that Dinesh D'Souza is not in my camp politically. But I also know that he is a wicked smart guy. He's Ivy League educated. He's done a lot of writing. He's made a lot of bestsellers. He has a lot of powerful friends on his side of the political framework. And I like parts of his life story as a great sort of American vision of what it is to be a success. The immigrant background that he presents. He wears glasses. I like it when folks who have those attributes succeed. I dislike that he is a convicted felon. I dislike that he does things that are outrageously and cartoonishly simple-minded. And he pitches some of his most recent work, these series of movies he has made, to people who I don't believe have his level of sophistication. On the other hand, I also was curious, does this documentary present something about the 2020 election that I need to be better informed of?
Right. Is it possible that there's some details that got glossed over in the media coverage that maybe are valid?
I am prepared for my antagonist in the public sphere of American life to give me news that my side's playing a raw deal and cheating.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I don't like that. I don't like dishonesty. I don't like what that presents. And in my private life, I try not to behave that way.
Right.
Even when it's just trying to mislead my children about my
Right.
habits. Because I want to watch TV at night and it's not what they want. Blah, blah, blah.
Well, I don't want to be misinformed either. I like to feel comfortable in that the decisions, the conclusions that I've come to are well reasoned, and that I have, they are a result of as much factual information as I can possibly get my hands on.
Let's cut down to a quick couple of points. This is from the losing side of the last presidential election. These are Trump supporters who are Republican by affiliation, who are conservative by ideological leaning, who are media personalities. Dinesh D'Souza has had a long publication career. He's made a number of movies, and he's very often a pundit on TV.
He's a convicted felon?
He is.
What did he do?
I think some kind of a campaign finance law break.
Oh, okay.
He was brought on charges. He was pardoned by President Trump.
Okay.
In, I think, 2018. But that's certainly in his background. He did jail time, I think, somewhere here in the San Diego prison.
So this is almost like a thank you card.
It could be considered that kind of
to
thing.
Trump, okay.
Quid pro quo.
Yeah.
This is the quo.
Yeah, okay.
This is also supported by and co-produced with the assistance of the
Salem Media Group.
Salem Media Group.
Which is funny, considering how many witch hunts
Right.
Trump
I always
was a
thought that was
victim
weird.
of.
Now, I listen to Salem Media Group personalities on the AM talk radio scene when I'm taking long drives because I sort of want to be informed by... I often talk about them as AM crazies because I know they're going to say things that I find outrageous. But I also realize they're saying things that I consider outrageous, but they're often basing that on the same media that I am consuming, but having an entirely different point of view.
Right.
So these are people who are, in a sense, being sore losers. You can look at this whole movie that way. Mm-hmm. But let's set aside sore loser and try to think about what their argument is. More on that as we move along.
Right.
The next thing to realize is that D'Souza and the various talking heads he surrounds himself with, they know how to cheat to the camera. They know how to fluff up their voice. They speak in very coherent sentences, even when what they say with those sentences veers into incoherence. D'Souza himself speaks in very careful sentences with a modest inflection of point of origin because he is an immigrant. And that's an interesting thing to listen to because you sit forward to give him attention and you're rewarded by very well-composed language skills. And those language skills tend to periodically summarize what the other talking heads in this movie have just said. It's a teacherly exercise. I tried to do this as well. You say something, you let it go for 10 minutes, and then you pause, you re-say what just happened, and then you transition to the next thing. And it begins with things that even the most ignorant voter can appreciate, which is the value of exercising franchise to influence the body politic according to your beliefs, whatever they may be. He uses a quote from Ronald Reagan to kick off this idea.
Every time we vote, we're standing up side by side with the Founding Fathers, with the men of Valley Forge, with patriots and pioneers throughout our history, with all those who dedicated their lives to making this a nation of the people, by the people, and for the people.
This movie is a documentary. There's a tremendous amount of cutting. And when you see cutting, when you're kind of laboring in the field of the real, you have to be alert. What's being removed and excised to privilege one thing over another? This is particularly valuable in as much as really the whole movie is talking heads talking about video that they are analyzing for us to understand what their interpretations are.
Yeah.
All they are is talking at a table.
I was honestly kind of stunned at one point when they begin talking to the True the Vote couple, how long of basically a scene it is where they're just the four of them sitting at this table discussing evidence that True the Vote has collected. And they're just sitting there talking. And occasionally, we cut to whatever image is on the
I'd like
laptop.
to say it's not occasionally. We cut an awful lot. So, for example, if you're just to film four people sitting at a conference table, which is how a lot of this movie is organized, there are sometimes, it appears, at least 3 different cameras aimed at them at any one time. One camera that seems to be on a track that moves laterally, very slowly. That's sort of the captivating master shot. And then cutaways to each of the primary speakers. But because there are so many cameras, and I'm aware of how TV sitcoms are produced, and I'm aware of how you make a movie, I can't help but think this is all very well rehearsed to organize where the cutaways are going to be, unless they indeed brought a camera and put it on every one of the individuals.
Right.
But we don't see those individual cameras with the overall tracking shot. In other words, this is presented to us as a documentary, but it feels extremely scripted and organized to look like a documentary. So jumping back again, this is all just about craft stuff. Who's doing what, to whom, and why? Dinesh D'Souza and his wife, Debbie, are on-screen personalities through a lot of this movie. Debbie says almost nothing, except to sort of bat her eyes at her husband, reflect on what's going on. Occasionally we even have insert shots of them holding hands in the middle of things, as if they're reassuring one another. Right. It's a very weird set of images, because she is there as a co-director, as a co-writer, yet she says almost nothing on screen. Everything is about Dinesh and what he is talking about, but she's there to constantly witness it. The movie is organized and punctuated by scenes of them at home.
Yeah.
There's a set piece of him sitting at a kitchen island looking at his laptop, and he gets a phone call. And he answers the phone, and it's one of the other talking heads who we've met in an earlier sequence, and she comes in as if to say, well, who is that, Dinesh?
Right.
And then he summarizes what the call was about. These are gimmicky things.
Well, I was painfully aware of much of the handheld camera work for these, and it's 2 people talking in a kitchen, and yet the camera is floating around and unstable, because it really adds like that visceral.
Right.
So, like, as if we're watching something that's true and important.
Well, and this is how real people conduct themselves in the privacy of their home.
Yeah.
They're always sort of cheated to the camera just so you can see their faces as they talk to one another. It's so goofy. And my little antennae go up because I can't stand that kind of obvious manipulation, which is being traded on throughout the course of this as a kind of counter-journalism to the bad journalism that many of his talking heads refer to, things like the New York Times, the Washington Post, as these invalid lamestream media sources that we cannot trust. And this documentary is meant to be trustworthy, but it's clearly not.
Yeah.
The conventions that it uses technically and how it's assembled is at best reality television. This is a super creative form of nonfiction, which really, when you draw it all down, this is an essay.
One of the things that I always say about documentary, because the majority of people, when they hear documentary and they watch a documentary, just having it exist under that term puts us in this state where we're sort of more willing to accept what is being presented as truth in some way.
That it's trustworthy.
Right.
That we can believe it, even if it's not about facts.
Right.
But it seems to our hearts true.
Right, right. But the thing is, when you go and you watch Star Wars, you know that this is just a story that's being told. I don't believe that Luke Skywalker existed and that I'm watching, actual events as they unfolded in a galaxy far, far away. But documentaries are just as meticulously created, just as meticulously edited. They are very intentionally designed to convey a specific point of view that the filmmaker wants you to walk away from the film sharing, or at least considering.
That's right. Every documentarian is nonetheless making choices about what sound we're going to hear and what images we're going to see, even if they're trying to be as fair-minded toward the subject as can be constructed.
Right.
That's powerful when we feel that the person in charge is not grinding away at some partisan millstone. In this example, though, it's clear that Dinesh is. He's not ignorant of that fact, nor does he withhold it.
Right.
He expresses this in an opening monologue.
Elections are the lifeblood of our democracy. They are the mechanism by which the American people choose who is going to rule on their behalf and for their interests and welfare. Without elections, there would be no way for the American people, for us, to exercise our legitimate sway on the future direction of this country.
As I understood this documentary's position, it suggests that because all of us are walking around with smartphones that have unique digital signatures that can be geolocated, especially through the various apps that we all tend to use, our person, as long as we're carrying our device, can be known to within a few square meters at all times, whether the device is on or not.
Right.
On that basis, all of that data is being collected by all of the big tech companies. We know this. It feels weird. Facebook knows things about me. That's why IG feeds me things.
Yeah.
Amazon will ask me to buy stuff because it knows things about me, which I haven't offered.
That thing is listening to you 24 hours a day, on or off. So if you ever want to conspire about a crime, put your phone in
you need to go swim in the ocean,
right?
and learn another language, and preferably sign at night with a friend that you're going to be a co-conspirator with. So,
I've learned to use the Aldous lamp just for that purpose.
Smoke signals, baby. That's all the way from me. Semaphore is all there is to it. So that's one core thing that this movie's basis sits on. Okay, so I don't have any dispute over that. I agree. That feels both weird and it's true. Now, all of that data, as we've become aware of the last generation, is controlled and held somewhere. All of those terabytes of material on all of us, performing what I think he refers to as a life pattern. Now, this life pattern held by these companies can be bought and sold. That's all true. I have no dispute. We also know that there are various lobbying groups on all sides of the aisle pitching their points of view, and that some of these lobbying groups are pitching their point of view by paying for some of that data, mining it for the kinds of people they're trying to reach with the messages they want to sell. Again, no dispute. The next piece is where it gets a little dicey to me. This documentary posits that one small group called True the Vote, which was created during the Obama administration to dispute or make sure that elections were being conducted fairly, that's their kind of public-facing point of view, they took a tranche of data collected by one data miner and analyzed 5 different key battleground states of activities, but really cities, where voting was important to that last election. And on the basis of applying that geolocation technology to various people who had repetitive patterns, they came to some startling conclusions. Everything that I've said up to now, which I know has been lengthy, Garrett can talk, I don't have any dispute with. They go to pains when they describe how this data was interpreted. But what they arrive at on the other side is people who have questionable behavior because they repetitively go through this life pattern based on geolocation that seems to overlap not just with standalone ballot boxes during the fall of 2020, but also going near, never mentioned, political nonprofits. which we assume to be some kind of democratic outreach, get out the vote kind of a thing. But it's never once specified what these groups are. Never once.
Right. They are just referred to as non-profit groups because this way they can avoid the inevitable lawsuits that would follow if they were to name drop any of them.
Exactly right. And they're careful about that. But because they name nobody, are they talking about a cancer research institute? Are they talking about a public school? Are they talking about an old folks' home? They jump over that hurdle and say, these groups harvest ballots. And then couriers, which they call mules,
right,
because that's a syndicate associated with the drug trade, grab all of these ballots, and then they go to these drop boxes packing the vote illegally.
Right.
That's the grand supposition of this whole thing.
Right. Which is funny because the sort of the science of language, because when you call them ballot harvesters, that sounds nefarious, like as if somebody is going out and like just scooping up all these ballots. I've voted by mail before, and I've also taken in the ballots for members of my family as well. So I'm a ballot harvester,
right,
by definition.
They even express that that's possible, but then they wink, wink, and nudge at you. The people that they're actually thinking about are earning money by doing this per ballot that they're delivering. And so this is a profit-making opportunity for probably low-wage workers for a month every couple of years when an election comes up. And this is being done by the Democrats to subvert democracy, big D democracy, and destroy America. I understand that's possible, but I'm waiting for the evidence to convince me of what's going on. From that point, the documentary goes into some surveillance footage of certain key ballot boxes where people are behaving towards these ballot boxes. Now, I lived through COVID times. And I remember people walking around with latex gloves.
Right.
And I remember people queuing up. And I remember people doing things at odd times of day. And I remember people behaving strangely out in public. And that's exactly what we see in the surveillance photos, which doesn't mean there's bad things happening, but it doesn't mean there isn't.
Well, yeah. So I would go a step further. We don't know that any of the footage presented to us is authentic because they could have shot anything they wanted, anywhere they wanted. But let's just assume that the...
Let me pause on that. I'm sorry. There are reenactments of people getting into their car and throwing ballots.
Some guy with like a hoodie,
yeah,
looking around as he, skulks up to the ballot box, right?
Behaving in a hanky way so D'Souza can describe what's happening. There are ballot boxes that they have either purchased from whatever that supplier is or that they found. They're definitely creating artificial material that has nothing to do with the capital R real,
right, and
placing it before us. And if you're not paying attention, you think, what's that white kid in the hoodie doing with his bike in front of that box?
They go to painstaking lengths to narrate the footage we see to influence the viewer into believing they're seeing something that they're not. Somebody will roll up to the ballot box and they're like, it's 2:30 in the morning. And then they'll sarcastically be like, oh yeah, because we all vote at 2:30 in the morning. Maybe they work the late shift.
There's a further detail of that they frequently digest the fact that a great many of these people that they key on are taking photographs of the box, or they're doing selfies of themselves dropping things on the box.
Right.
But there was a campaign afoot.
Right.
To get out the vote. Show that you're voting. To encourage other voters.
Well,
and so on.
Certainly, we also live in the age of social media where that's just what people do now. Mm-hmm. And that was another thing that I found to be to be fallacious. They said that one of the requirements for payment is that you get proof, right? You could show them. Well, nobody is taking video of themselves putting a bunch of ballots in a box. What you have is somebody taking a picture of the ballot box after they've dropped their one ballot in. And how is that proof that you've stuffed that ballot box?
We're presenting a counter-narrative based on the evidence that we were offered in this documentary about what it could mean. D'Souza is entitled to his position. And clearly he believes in it. He's published a tie-in book that goes along with this. It had to be delayed because there were issues. There were some fungible things about what's going to be legally defensible and what isn't.
At least he believes that you're going to believe it when you buy his movie and his book.
Let's also just go down the road of just one of those clips of somebody dropping off a ballot and then photographing themselves to prove it, which D'Souza says is them making proof of their work so they can be paid for doing this illegal thing. But might it also be watching somebody commit a fraud and not actually voter fraud? What am I saying? If I were a wage slave and I had this golden opportunity to earn $10 a ballot, which is what he says this is probably the going rate for ballot stuffing, I would take the one ballot that's my ballot, and I would go to a box and place it in the key, take a photograph, take my ballot out, go to the next box, and do it again.
Right.
And I would do that all day long until I had done this enough to have a day's worth of wages. What is the fraud that I've committed? It's a kind of employment fraud. It's not voter fraud.
Right.
Because that's what I think a rational person would do.
Of course.
If they're already spending the day having to drive around in their own vehicle to try to earn $10 a ballot, you can hit so many different ballot boxes across the course of an afternoon. That's the way to earn your money.
Right.
Why would you even monkey with this? Because if you're willing to commit the kind of fraud he's saying that you're willing to commit, why would you care what the result is? Your America is not the one that Biden and Trump are at war with. Your America is about, can I pay my rent?
Right.
Consequently, you're going to drive rationally the best way forward, which is cheat.
Right.
So that's my counter reading of much of this evidence, that I'll sweep through and say, okay, if everybody's cheating, great, but the people who would be performing the cheat, the so-called mules, they're going to do it in the way that is most beneficial to them. And there is no way to counter or prove what they have done, aside from they say so, or take a picture of themselves, because they don't want to tap surveillance footage and call out the whole fraud. The game would be cooked.
Right. Well, and I find it odd, too, that some would be like, well, I'm going to intentionally engage in voter fraud, but I don't want to deceive the people that are paying me to execute this voter fraud.
We're going to be honest criminals.
Right.
Yeah. When the movie was done, and I Googled some things about it, some of the mapping data that we look at is not actually of the place we're told that we're looking at. Apparently there's some example in this where we're looking at a map of Atlanta, watching the geolocation and the life patterns of certain key individuals, these so-called mules. But we're actually looking at a map that could be of Moscow, Russia. I don't know that at first glance, and I don't know what happened. Maybe they just purchased the wrong footage, or maybe they're pulling one over on us, and it's a big, gigantic, screw you, you dummy. You can't even tell the difference.
Maybe they just didn't care.
Yeah, because the folks who are going to go in for this already are grinding an axe to say Democrats are miserable people, Joe Biden is an old fool, and as you pointed out at the beginning of all of this, the second coming of the Jesus is this guy named Donald J. J for Jesus? No, that's too far. It's John, but we'll accept that he's Jesus-like.
I mean, it was still an apostle, right?
right.
I mean, so he's close.
Well, like in Last Temptation, he was just off the edge of the round table, because he's like, I don't eat that stuff with you people. There's a whole lot of noisy nonsense, in my view, of how this movie makes its arguments.
This film holds its audience in contempt. It's so flimsy. The arguments are so circumstantial at best. It's the cinematic equivalent of going to a small child and doing that removing your thumb trick.
Yeah. There are a few things that this movie gets right that are largely in the first 10 minutes. And among the things that it gets right, it was clear during election 2020 that Donald Trump, as the sitting president, had a bully pulpit to just knock whoever he wished around because that's his way. Also, he's a funny guy.
Oh, yeah, he's hilarious.
He's a great comedian. Joe Biden spent most of the campaign trying to avoid being the stuttering old man-ish looking guy that many people accuse him of being, and campaigned very little. Instead, he used his lieutenants and stand-ins and various celebrities to sort of push his messaging, and largely stayed in the bunker. Of course, this was COVID times. He was advised to do that as a person in that old group of people who are susceptible to the dire effects of this illness, and so on. So all of that's true. And then by the time we got to Election Day 2020, it was also true that because of the way the dateline works and how voting counts work, that by the time folks on the West Coast were going to bed, there was no good news yet from the West Coast about any kind of an election result because the votes had only just begun.
Right.
But things were already being called all across the East Coast and the Southeast, which are, you guessed it, strongholds of conservative believers who are GOP backers, which means that Trump was on the ascent. Mm-hmm. But when you woke up the day after, there was a kind of rebalancing as many more of those votes were counted. There's nothing wrong with that. It takes a while to tally more than 100 million votes, even if you've got good computer systems.
Oh, yeah.
And, of course, we have arguments about that, because every single state has its own election process. Some that are on paper, most that are on some kind of digital tool, but there is no integrative across the 50 states and all the territories system that is uniform.
Right.
That creates its own kind of crisis, but that's outside of what this movie is concerned with.
Well, and two, it's my understanding that most places they can't. You can mail in your ballot early, but they, by law, cannot count those ballots
until the election is
day.
done.
Yeah, the election is over. Yeah, so
and that's I think midnight of the day, and then they collect them all in some warehouse space. And feed them into machines, or they got a whole bunch of volunteers, or even if they're paid workers, to count stuff just by hand, whatever the process is. Speed all of that along. We still arrive at a conclusion that many millions more people voted for the non-incumbent Joe Biden, the upstart, versus the incumbent Donald Trump. And that's not disputed by this documentary. Here is my bottom line with this, Ed. You remember those nonprofits they keep referring to, the harvesters that the mules pick up their bags of nefariously gotten votes? They never say that any of those different lobbying groups, they never say what they were, which means they could also have been conservative-leaning lobbying groups.
Right. Maybe they were all mules stuffing Trump ballots in there, and it wasn't as close.
That's right.
You could just easily look at the evidence that they have.
And as we know from after-the-fact interviews with the lamestream media, New York Times, WAPO, and others, it is true that some people who voted for Trump in the original election reversed course and did not vote for him a second time. Who's to say that the ballots being harvested by this plot of mules, if that's true, were all voting for Joe Biden?
Right.
But here's even another gripe of mine, when you drill this down. If the big data scooping of the geolocation is as oddly specific as it is, and they go out of their way to point out the validity of this process, find 10 people, drill in and go find them.
Mm-hmm.
Catch them after the fact and say, were you a mule? What is a mule, sir? This is a mule. Was that you? Instead, what we get is a couple of witness testimonials from people who have their voices scrubbed, and they sit against a background where we can't see their faces, and they confess to things that they observed or things that they did, which are not tied in with the conspiracy that he's talking about. It's just other ideas of fraud that the Democrats are committing against the Republicans.
Right, so it reinforces the central argument by showing that, hey, they're doing it in other places as well, I guess.
How do we know? Because this lady just told us, and she wouldn't lie. To reiterate, I tried to make sure that I went into this movie with as fair-minded and open-minded of sensitivity as I could have.
Absolutely.
Knowing that I am not in D'Souza's camp. And I left the other side believing that it's technically manipulating me through editing.
Mm-hmm.
Its content has been manipulated to shield proofs, and it doesn't reliably prove anything.
Right.
Because those proofs themselves can't be directly tied to what it is that he's talking about unless you already accept that what he's telling you is the truth, because you've got to have faith.
Which is, right, exactly. Which is a total logical fallacy. It's like, the premise is true because the premise is true.
When this movie was released in May of 2022, I can remember walking around and seeing a poster for it in my neighborhood theater and thinking, what's this all about? Point. It was in theaters against The Batman, Jackass Forever, RRR, Everything Everywhere All at Once, Ambulance, The Northman, The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent, Top Gun Maverick. I don't know what to say, except that the competition in the fictional part of that season was pretty strong.
Oh, yeah. I liked every one of these. Although it does dawn on me right now that 2000 Mules might have more accurately been named Jackass Forever.
Boop boopity doo.